This week we're looking at Romans 14, and I love the end of Romans. You know, the first part of Romans and the middle of Romans is very talking about theology and some really deep stuff. And then you get to the end of Romans, and Paul starts talking about very practical things. And today we want to look at how far should we go to maintain unity with other Christians. And when I say unity with other Christians, one of the things I think is our downfall as Christians is you drive down the street and you see all these different denomination churches. And I think it's sad that if you were not a believer or Christian and you see all these churches, you just go, why do they all have different names, all different denominations? Can't these people get along with each other? And sadly, the stuff that we have fought over is kind of silly. There was a denomination that was talking to me once to be a minister for them. And so I had to take some courses to learn their history. And the big split came. Now, some of you might not know who I'm talking about, but the big split came because some of their churches were using Bill Gaither music. Now, Bill Gaither today is considered pretty traditional Southern gospel, but back when he was younger in the Gaither trio, they were considered contemporary, and some churches started using their music, and other churches thought they were too contemporary, and here a denomination split basically over Gaither music. And you go, really? That's what you split over? And when I was a kid, one of my favorite holidays, now nothing tops Christmas as a kid, but probably second was Halloween. Isn't Halloween the greatest holiday, basically, outside of Christmas where you get gifts? Halloween, you got free candy. And we used to take pillowcases, and we would fill up a pillowcase. I haven't seen a kid in a pillowcase in I don't know how long, and they never fill them up because they get tired and they go play Nintendo, right? And so when I was a kid, we didn't have that, so we would spend all night till they turned the lights off. We would go door to door getting candy, right? I loved Halloween. Free candy. Who doesn't like that? So then I go to the Bible Belt and go to a Christian school, and it was the first time I'm in a Bible college, and I'm mentioning Halloween to some friends and how awesome Halloween is, and that's when it came to my attention. There were Christians against Halloween, because Halloween was the Satan's holiday. It was the devil's holiday. Now me, I'm like, okay, on that day I give them a break. You know what I mean? I'm getting free candy. You know, give them a break on that one day of the year. Come on. And yet, I didn't realize that there were Christians to this day that think bad of you if you do Halloween. We used to do junior church, and every year I had to give us a little bit of a spiel to people saying, okay, we're going to do kind of a Halloween thing with our kids. Don't wear witch costumes, don't wear ghost costumes, don't do anything that's considered, devilish, and so we would do that just to keep some people happy. But you would just run into people that look at you and go, oh, that's terrible. And they think less of you. And so today we want to look at how far do you go to maintain unity with people who fight over these kind of things, all right? And that's what we want to look at. And so here's our question that we want to look at, all right? Do you have friends that have stricter boundaries or rules than you? Like they don't play cards, drink alcohol, etc. All right? Do you have friends like that? Or do you have friends that have less strict boundaries than you? You're actually stricter than them. All right? You either have friends who are not as strict as you, or stricter than you, right? Most of the time. We have friends that kind of fall into that. And I've come up with a list of 10 things that in my life, I have seen people actually get mad about, all right? And so we see theater, okay? I know Christians who won't go see a movie at a theater. In fact, a lot of these people, they think movies are wrong, but films are okay. And they would say things like, Billy Graham has films, Hollywood has movies. Now, I have yet to figure out the difference except the subject matter. I don't know, I can't tell the difference between a movie and a film, all right? Cosmetics. There are some places it's not as big as it used to be, but there are still some denominations that frown on cosmetics. You know, we'll look at fashion in a moment, but like, you know, earrings, anything that, you know, makes you look a little prettier. And as one preacher used to say, even a barn needs a new paint every once in a while, right? You know, so I don't know how makeup hurts, right? But some people get a little upset over that, right? A little upset. Alcohol, that's still a biggie. At least in American Christianity, alcohol is a big deal. There are those who think alcohol, Christians should never drink. And then there are those who think Christians should drink in moderation. Now, this is a tough one because, again, this is where there's some real big dividing lines. And yet Jesus actually made wine, right? Turned water into wine. We also see tobacco. This is basically a Mason-Dixon line thing. If you're on one side of the Mason-Dixon line, tobacco is not as bad because they grow tobacco in the South. In the North, they're normally more against tobacco smoking, cigarette smoking, than you would be in the South, because you would have people in your church who made a lot of money off of their tobacco crops, right? And then we have card playing. You can play Uno, but you can't play rummy, euchre. Euchre's a Michigan. For those of you who are watching this not from Michigan, euchre I think is more of a Michigan northern game, but you can play Uno, but you can't play regular type of cards, poker, that kind of thing. Then we get to dancing. You know, dancing's not good. Fashion, you can't be trendy. You got to be careful. You know, I read of one preacher, some ladies came up to him one time and said, you know, there's some women not wearing stockings. This is going way back, and before, when women were always wearing stockings, and went to the preacher and said, you need to tell these women they need to wear stockings. And his response to them was, you know, Jesus' mother Mary did not wear stockings. And it never dawned on them that that's a fashion thing, right? And then years later, this was going back some time, years later, many women stopped wearing stockings. Bible translation used. It amazes me to this day how you go into some just driving down the road, you'll see a church that will tell you it's Bible translation. And when they say like KJV, King James only, that tells you that's the only version allowed in their church. Then you got music. Again, I just gave you a Bill Gaither, who's considered Southern gospel. But in his heyday, that was divisive, what Bill Gaither's music. It's hard to think that because he lives would divide a church or divide a group. But, you know, one of the songs he wrote. And then we have material wealth. It's always interesting that, you know, people want to tell you how to spend your money. And, you know, there have been, I know some ministers that have written books and have made a lot of money through their book writing. They've been attacked because their house is too big or the car they drive is too nice. And so, you know, people want to tell others how they should spend their money. So these are 10 things that people get angry about and fight over what Christians should do. So here's the question I have for you. How do you make up the boundaries that you do or don't have? in that list? What's your music list? I mean, now again, I'm showing my age. But when I was in college, it was really against rock music back then. And there were people that would do seminars in churches about playing rock music records backwards. Now again, some of you are looking at me like I'm crazy, but I don't know who listens to a record backwards, but that's what they would say. And you could hear Satan's voice. And you'd go, wow, man, we're really looking under rocks that I would have never turned over, right? And so, man, through the years, and I don't know what we're going to be fighting over next year, but Christians are going to always fight over silly stuff. And so what are your boundaries? What is it that you make your rules? And then what do you think about people that don't have the same rules? Or what do you think about people that have rules that you don't have that you think are kind of silly? Now, the thing I want to point out, all those rules, whether it's music, whether it's alcohol, whatever it is, people that have those rules, I want to point this out because a lot of those things, I said the thing about films and people not going to theaters. I've had pastors argue with me that they will not go to a movie theater. Now again, I'm showing my age. They would not go to a movie theater because of people wouldn't know what movie they were going to see inside, but they would go to Blockbuster. What in the world is the difference, right? I don't understand this, okay? However, it doesn't matter where you fell on those 10 things. People had those rules for a reason. And their rules were that they wouldn't disappoint God. They wouldn't anger God. And so you got to be careful that even if you think these rules are silly, people who have them are trying to do them for a good reason, even if they're silly. Does that make sense? Even though they're silly, they're trying to have the rule for a good reason. All right? And so Paul is writing, and the early church was very diverse with its Jewish and Gentile Christians coming together. And they had very little in common. So you had Jews and Gentiles going to church together, and Paul is explaining to them how to get along. Because, here's the deal, these Jews who grew up as Jews with all these rules are now becoming Christians, and you know what they do? They bring with them things they were taught as a kid. Now, I grew up very conservative. Now, I went to Bible college and found out there were people even more conservative than me, like I mentioned the Halloween stuff, but I was still considered conservative. And even to this day, I got to check myself because there are things I know is not wrong, but I just don't like them because I was brought up that they were wrong. Does that make sense? I don't think they're wrong, but it's still in me because I was taught at a young age that they were wrong. I remember we have a couple, one of my dear friends who I adore. Again, in these small churches, people marry, I don't want to say intermarry because that would be that would be bad. But families marry, and it's all legit, but they all marry, and these small churches, they have a history. And I remember the first wedding in our church, and I was standing up in the wedding, and it was the first church, or the first wedding really in our church that had dancing at the wedding. That was a big deal. And I remember as a teenager, because I'm standing up in this wedding as a teenager going, oh man, I don't even know how to dance. Because all of our weddings didn't have dancing. And this was controversial. We had a wedding in our church. And I remember it was held at a golf course, and there was actually going to be alcohol at the wedding too. And so they had dinner kind of without the alcohol. They were trying to make both sides of the family happy. And so they had alcohol when the dancing started, they kind of opened up the bar. And I remember our pastor left when the dancing happened, right? You see how that is, And so you just go, wow, have we come a long way? And yet there's many churches today that would still go, oh, you don't have alcohol at a wedding, you don't have dancing at a wedding. And so I have been to weddings, and not that far ago, that there wouldn't have been alcohol or dancing. And you just sit around and look at each other and go, well, we're at a wedding, right? It's just what life is. And so you get that in you, even down the road, sometimes it stays with you, all right? So what does the Bible say? We always say here, this is a good time to open up, get the Crosswaves app. I've got a bunch of stuff in there that verses that I mentioned in the deep dive and that I just mentioned and referenced, and I got all kinds of things in there that we don't have time to get to. So always follow along in the Crosswaves app. So let's start reading in Romans 14 and see what Paul tells us, okay? Accept other believers who are weak in faith and don't argue with them about what they think is right or wrong. Again, don't argue with them. For instance, one person believes it's all right to eat anything, but another believer with a sensitive conscience will only eat vegetables. We would call that a vegetarian. Here's the dilemma they were having back then, is they were having trouble figuring out what meat was kosher and what meat wasn't. And you could get a great deal on meat that was offered to idols. But there were Christians like that meat was offered to idols, even though it's discounted. We shouldn't eat that because it was offered to idol. And other Christians who are cheap were like, that's a good deal, right? And then you had other Christians go, I ain't going to play this game. I'm just going to become a vegetarian. All right? And so Paul's got all these different people kind of in the church all disagreeing with each other. And he says, those who feel free to eat anything must not look down on those who don't. And those who don't eat certain foods must not condemn those who do, for God has accepted them. So you've got Paul saying, if you don't eat the meat, get mad at those who do. And those who do, don't look down at those who don't. And so our point here is accepting each other's differences is our only option. So if you come across somebody who thinks it's wrong to drink alcohol, for whatever reason, just go, okay. Just okay. I'm not here to argue with you. If somebody thinks that dancing is wrong, okay. All right? Now, that doesn't mean they're right. That just means you're not to argue with them. You're not to confront with them. All right? Now I'm going to skip down to verse 5, and it says, in the same way, some think one day is more holy than another day, while others think every day is alike. You should each be fully convinced that whichever day you choose is acceptable. Those who worship the Lord on a special day do it to honor Him. Those who eat any kind of food do so to honor the Lord, since they gave thanks before eating. Now, these first few verses here are important to us at Crosswaves because many of our groups don't meet on Sundays. And it's funny because Easter was not that long ago from when this message is being given. And so all what pastors do, we pastors get together and we go, yeah, man, we had a big crowd on Sunday. We had X amount of people. We were 60% more than normal. We had 40% more than normal. All these pastors are talking. And I'm actually in a room with 5 other pastors. And they're all talking about their big day on Easter. And they looked at me and said, how big was your day? I go, I didn't go to church on Easter. What? Now again, you know me, all right? And I get in trouble all the time just because I just get in trouble all the time. And I just looked at them and I said, guys, I said, first of all, Easter's not a big day to me. I got Facebook. Why do I want to see these people that I'm not going to see again to Christmas? They're not coming back, Whoa, And again, I'm just giving that to give them a hard time. And I actually was very happy for them. And I just said, whatever day you worship the Lord, it's okay. And what's fascinating is there are people that find out that we at Crosswaves, many of our home groups don't meet on Sundays. They just can't wrap their mind around that. And yet in the early church, there were Christians that felt like you needed to meet on Saturday. Why? Because that's the Sabbath. And of all the 10 Commandments, all the 10 Commandments are mentioned again at least 4 times in the New Testament after Jesus' resurrection, except remember the Sabbath. It's not mentioned at all. And the others are about God's character. What God cares about is that we take time and worship Him. And He doesn't care what day it is. And so these verses are very important to us at Crosswaves. And so it's important that you spend time every week worshiping and studying about God and being in your Christian community. It doesn't matter what day it is. And then he says it doesn't matter what food you eat, as long as you you bless it before you eat. You're giving God thanks for what you eat. And then he says, and those who refuse to eat certain foods also want to please the Lord and give thanks to God. So those who don't eat certain things, those who are vegetarians, are still asking God to bless what they're eating. And he says, for we don't live for ourselves or die for ourselves. If we live, it's to honor the Lord, and if we die, it's to honor the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. Christ died and rose again for this very purpose, to be both Lord of the living and of the dead. The word Lord is found 7 times in those verses from 5 through 9. 7 times you see the word Lord. And what that is telling us is that we stand before Him and we don't have the right to play God to other people. We don't have the right. There's only one Lord, and He makes that decision. And so when you come across somebody who doesn't see things the way you do, you go, okay, that's all right. Now this is even going to get more complicated in a moment. Because some of the things you don't do because you think they're silly. And yet, you got to be careful. So, we go on in verse 10. It says, so why do you condemn another believer? Why do you look down on another believer? Remember, we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For the Scriptures say, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bend to me, and every tongue will declare allegiance, praise to God. And we continue reading, says, so each of us will give a personal account to God. So let's stop condemning each other. Decide instead to live in such a way that you will not cause another believer to stumble or fall. So we could have an argument and go, that's silly. That's stupid. But that's not what Paul's telling us to do. We do not judge our brothers and sisters in things in areas where the Bible does not speak directly. That's not what we do. And here's what I want you to get. This is what I want you to get. When making boundaries is what lordship is all about. We are to make God Lord of everything we have and everything we do. And so when we make boundaries, and this is what I was trying to say earlier, when people don't play cards, as silly as you think that is, that you can play Uno and not play with a regular deck of cards, and you go, what's the difference? Some people won't play Monopoly because there's dice involved. And you go, that's so silly. And yet, in their mind, they don't want to touch anything or do anything that's used for gambling. So when you have a boundary, you're trying to say, I want to put Christ first in everything. So their heart is in the right place, even if you think it's silly. Right? And so we have to decide, each of us. Now I'm not going to say this, please, this is me speaking for me. I don't drink. I can literally say that I have never been drunk in my entire life. I heard a professor say many years ago that you can't become a hog if you don't first become a pig. If you don't drink the first time, you'll never get drunk, right? I'm a minister. It would take one mistake of me drinking a little bit too much. And if you see me drink Diet Pepsis, you know I would drink too much. Right? So, it would take one mistake for me, I could hurt my testimony. So I have made a decision. I did not grow up in a drinking home. We did not have alcohol. We did not allow alcohol in our home. And I have continued that tradition on for me. And yet I'm out all the time with other Christians who would have something to drink. That's okay. But I just don't want to ever be seen as drunk. So I just don't drink. I'm okay because that's a boundary that I have made because I'm trying to put Christ first in my life. What I get into trouble is if I make that boundary on you. That's where we make the mistake. And so if somebody says, I don't play with regular cards because, poker's gambling and all that kind of stuff, and I just don't want to touch that stuff. I go, okay. Okay. That person's making a boundary that I don't need to make, but it's okay because I have boundaries that he might not need to make. Boundaries is how we are showing in our own life, in our mind, how we're putting Christ first and we're protecting ourselves that we don't sin. And so I want you to have your own boundaries, just don't put them on other people. Now, I want you to remember, we're not talking about sins that are mentioned in the Bible. We are to break fellowship with other denominations and other Christians who participate in outward sins that the Bible says is wrong and they think it's right. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about sin. We're talking about standards is what a lot of church people use the term. Standards, rules, boundaries we put around ourselves, barriers to keep us from sinning. And so we're not talking about sin. We're talking about, like I said, drunkenness is a sin, not drinking. But I've put a boundary so I don't drink, so I don't get to the drunkenness. Other people might have their boundaries in other areas, and that's okay, all right? So let's continue on. I know and am convinced of the authority of the Lord Jesus that no food in and of itself is wrong to eat. But if someone believes, and this is where it gets complicated, but if someone believes it is wrong, then for that person it is wrong. That's where it gets complicated. And if another believer is distressed by what you eat, you are not acting in love if you eat it. Don't let your eating ruin someone from whom Christ died. Wow. So if you think drinking is wrong and you've made that boundary, because you made the boundary, I want you to get this, you made the boundary because you're trying to put Christ first. So if you have this boundary that drinking is wrong and then you drink, what did you do? You crossed your personal boundary that you said, yeah, Christ is no longer first because I'm just going to drink when I want to drink. If it's playing cards and that's your boundary, and somebody else might think it's silly, but it's your boundary and you start playing cards, you've crossed the line where in your mind, you're not putting Christ first. Let's go on. Then you will not be criticized for doing something you believe is good. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of what we eat or drink, but of living a life of goodness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. And then Romans, earlier in this letter, Paul said, love each other with genuine affection and take delight in honoring each other. Now, you honor others by respecting their beliefs on putting Christ first, even if you do not see their observances as making sense. You're honoring them. Now, this is not hypocrisy. Okay? Now, you guys know I don't use the King James Version Bible when I'm preaching. There's nothing wrong with the King James. If that's what you have, it's fine. But if I go to a church and I ask them, what do they preach out of? And they say the King James Version. What am I going to preach out of? The King James Version. Even if they say on their sign, King James only, which I really think doesn't make any sense. But if that's what they believe, I'm going to preach out of it. This is not hypocrisy, because I'm not saying that's what I believe. It's not hypocrisy is when you say something and you do another. I am honoring them by reading out of the King James. I am honoring them if they don't play cards at night. I'm not pulling out a deck of cards, right? I'm honoring them. I'm not saying that's what I believe. I'm just honoring them. I'm not fighting them. I'm not arguing with them. Okay? Because I'm not doing it and saying, well, you know, I don't ever play cards. I'm just not doing it then because I want to honor and respect them. You know, there are churches out there that women always wear dresses when they go to church. And if you don't wear a dress to church, you get the stink eye. You know what I mean? And Terry and I've preached in many of those churches through my ministry. And every time we go to one of those churches, my wife wears a dress. Why? Because we're trying to honor them. We're not trying to be different. We're not trying to say, look at me. We have Christian liberty. No. And so it's important for us to get this. So how do you obey? Well, genuine acceptance of one another is the only option available to believers. That's what we read in verse 1. Second, individual Christians can disagree over customs and social habits and both be perfectly right with God. That's what we read in verse 6. Third, we must submit to the lordship of Christ and refrain from judging others because we all stand before the judgment seat of Christ and give an account of ourselves. We read that in verses 12 and 13. Now, I can talk to you on the side and go, you know, I think that doesn't make sense to have, you know, not go to a movie theater, but go to Blockbuster when they existed. That doesn't make sense to me. It made no sense to me. But it's okay for me to have that view. What's not okay is for me to go to a minister who practices that and then argue with him and fight with him and tell him he's stupid. No. Just go, okay. All right, brother. I love you, man. I'm just glad you're following Jesus. We're on the same team. All right? These three elements are essential to maintain Christian unity amidst our fantastic diversity. So let's finish up answering the question. How far should you go to maintain unity with other Christians? As far as we have to go. There is no end as long as it's not over actual sins. You know, I've got relatives in the Bible Belt that when I go and hang out with them, whatever their customs are is fine with me. I just don't debate them because it's not what I'm supposed to do. Because why? They've got those rules because in their mind, they're trying to put Christ first. And you know what? I got my own rules that I'm trying to put Christ first. And so I'm not to judge them and they're not to judge me. But as the mature Christian, when I'm in their presence, I just try my best not to do anything that they would find offensive because I want to honor and respect them. I hope that makes sense. And Paul is so practical here. And like I said, the lordship of Christ is what makes us make boundaries in the first place because we want to honor God. And so never get in the way of somebody else trying to honor God. I hope you think about that this week as we all strive to become more like Christ as we study the Bible, serve others, and share our faith together.